intellectual property. Should internet, you often see that internet companies lose money initially and then make it up once they get big. Is that a rational strategy, or should they, or is it just that they're sort of fooling investors? Should mergers, under what conditions should mergers be approved by the government? The government reviews mergers to make sure they're not too anti-competitive. How should we judge whether a merger should be approved or not? When is eminent domain to put together different parcels of land necessary? And when can it be abused? Should we be harsher on cartels or just someone who has monopoly power on his own? When is voting a good way to make a collective decision? So these are the sorts of problems that we will be thinking about all throughout this class, and I think you'll have something intelligent from an economics perspective to say about all these questions by the time we're done with the class. But in order to do that, you're going to have to master a range of tools, and I'm going to briefly run through what those are that we're going to be going through during the rest of the class. So today I just gave you sort of an introduction and an overview. On Thursday, we're going to start talking about the theory of the firm. So we'll ask, what is a corporation? What is the legal basis for a corporation? How do we think of companies as behaving most of the time in economics? What are the goals that companies try to achieve, and what goals should they try to achieve? How do internal conflicts within a company inhibit their ability to maximize their profits? How does the financial structure of a company help or inhibit this goal? What activities should go on within companies, and what activities should they contract with companies outside? So then we're going to turn a week from today to cost and talking about production and how you derive cost functions for the firm. So we'll talk about how to mathematically describe technologies that firms use to produce, how to graphically represent these, as well as costs, classifications of cost into fixed, variable, sunk, etc. costs, cost curves and their relationship to one another, assumptions about the measurement of cost curves. We'll talk about then we'll go a week from Thursday into the supply by firms and the duration and how that relates to the time for which the supply lasts. So we'll talk about how much a competitive firm supplies, how to relate profits to costs. We'll then talk about how firms respond to temporary shocks and how that compares to how they respond to more long-lasting shocks to demand, how these are related to one another mathematically, and how to think about real time in relationship to notions of short run and long run. Then we'll talk about industry supply and the profits that firms make, or the rents that they earn. And we'll relate industry supply to individual firm supply. We'll decompose supply into entry by new firms and expansion of existing firms. We'll talk about when competitive firms make profits and the role of exceptional technology or talents in allowing them to do so, as well as about empirical regularities about the distribution of firm size and talents. Then we'll go into market equilibrium. And we'll start with a graphical representation of a simple model of general equilibrium. We'll talk about why international trade helps promote efficiency and the social efficiency of the price system, what you've usually heard called the fundamental welfare theorems. And we'll talk about when, in fact, those theorems mean that the price system and markets are superior, and when actually they mean something very different entirely. We'll then talk about externalities and Pagu's principle and different ways of applying it, cap and trade versus damages versus Pigouvian taxation. We'll then talk about the Coase theorem and the role that information plays in solving externality problems. And we'll follow that up by talking about how in practice economists try to assess the magnitudes of externalities, both through objective calculations about costs and benefits and using science. And we'll do a particular application of that to the statistical value of human lives and health and its use in evaluating externalities from carbon emissions and global warming. Then we'll talk about contingent valuation surveys and how those can be, in principle, used to get out of people how much value they have for various things that are hard to just determine through science, and what the problems are with those in terms of incentives. Okay, then we'll talk about monopoly theory and how monopolists maximize profits, optimal pricing and its relationship to elasticities of demand. We'll then talk about the notion of deadweight loss in both theory and in data, and a little bit about tax pass-through under monopoly. Then we'll turn to regulation of a natural monopoly and talk about the differences between average and marginal cost regulation, as well as the informational problems that arise in trying to implement regulation. We'll then talk about free entry as a potential cause of average cost pricing, not just regulation. And we'll relate that to what you've usually heard called adverse selection and other things that cause problem in insurance markets and other markets where I don't know what the value of interacting with a consumer on the other side of the market is. Then we'll talk about how to design products. So both of those lectures will be about the quantity that a monopolist supplies, or how we can regulate the monopolist to supply a better quantity. But then we'll start talking about how monopolists design their products on dimensions other than just how much they sell. And we'll talk about perfect price discrimination and why that's so difficult to achieve. And then about how monopolists will design products to maximize profits. And the key idea there will be the distinction between a marginal consumer and an average consumer, and how a firm targets its products to be valuable to marginal rather than to average consumers. And we'll apply that to Hotelling's model of spatial competition between firms and its political implications about swing voters and things like that. Then we'll talk about price discrimination, and we'll view price discrimination as really just an application of the principles of how a monopolist designs products. And we'll use that to think about third-degree price discriminations, and that'll help us think about medicines and how they're priced in developing countries. We'll then talk about second-degree price discrimination and use that to think about quantity discounts and apply it to things like auctions. Then we'll talk about intellectual property and the role that monopoly profits play as an incentive to firms to innovate and create new products in the first place, and the importance of dynamics in competition, and the role that intellectual property plays as a tool to encourage the entry of new innovative products into the market. We'll then talk about optimal intellectual property policy and alternatives to intellectual property as a way of incentivizing innovation. Then we'll turn to issues about competition, imperfect competition, so oligopoly, thinking about how firms should behave in an oligopoly. That's a situation where there's not perfect competition, but there's also not just one firm. There's a few firms competing with each other. We'll talk about Cournot's model of oligopoly, which is the simplest one, and then the critique that Bertrand and Edgeworth made of that. We'll talk about the Stackelberg equilibrium and broader models of conjectural variations in oligopoly, and in particular we'll put focus on problems of collusion and Stigler's theory of collusive oligopoly. Then we'll talk about competition policy, the role that competition plays in reducing prices down to costs, the effect of increasing competition on prices, and the way in which, as there get to be a very large number of firms, prices get driven down to cost. we'll use that to develop some more general lessons about the effect of competition and apply that to thinking about competition law and policies that governments put in place to try to increase the amount of competition. Then we'll turn to talking about redistribution of wealth. So we'll talk about why people have an interest in redistribution of wealth, in particular the growth in domestic and global inequality, and the reasons why we might be concerned about this inequality, in particular the veil of ignorance argument of Rawls and Harsanyi as a reason why redistribution would be valuable. And we'll derive from that the framework of utilitarianism for thinking about the value of redistribution. And to do that, we'll give a little refresher on risk aversion and thinking about welfare. And then we'll use that to consider how progressive taxes should be depending on various features of the economic environment, and talk about data that has been brought to bear on those questions. Finally, we'll talk about public goods, and we'll approach that in sort of a little bit different way than perhaps you're used to. We'll talk about what happens when, rather than just there being a monopolist, there are many different firms that are each producing a product that are perfectly complementary with each other. And we're going to relate that to the problem of contributing to a public project, because that will relate what we do in oligopoly theory to the problem of public goods. We'll talk about how unanimity among the providers of a public good, forcing them to be unanimous in their contributions before we get to create the project, might potentially solve this problem, but in fact doesn't, and therefore why it's impossible to provide public goods privately at an efficient level. And that'll motivate thinking about how we provide public goods publicly and the role of voting in that. And that's where we'll wrap up the course. So I guess we have a few minutes left. You guys are free to leave, or we can keep talking about occupational licensure if you want, or whatever is good. Yeah, David.
I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
There's a video camera over there.
Yeah.
So are these lectures going to be
Yeah, all the lectures are going to be online, as it says in the course information, and they will be available on my YouTube page, which is Prof. Glen Weyl, P-R-O-F Glen Weyl. Not my title. It was given by Stieg Pierce, who took this course last year. So, and there's a link to that from my webpage and in the syllabus and so forth. So, yeah. Sorry, what's your name?
Jacob Conway.
Jacob.
One question I was going to ask earlier.
Yeah.
In terms of certification.
Yeah.
Why necessarily should it be government certification and not a private system?
Well, I think that the problem is a fewfold. One is that you need to give the certifiers some way to make money off of it. So you could have a private system that was subsidized, but it would be very hard to make money off of certifying doctors unless you charge the doctors for it rather than charging the public. But I think the problem with charging the doctors for it is the same thing we've seen with a lot of the rating agencies, which is that they get captured very easily by the people who pay the bills. So. Anybody else? Yeah. What's your name?
Jacob.
Jacob. Okay. Jacob Goldstein, Conway, and Jacob.
I think we're moving closer to the centralized system
Yeah.
with electronic medical records.
Well, we'll see if those get implemented.
But I think like a huge barrier to having a
Yeah.
centralized data system is patients giving the right to have their information or diagnostics put into a system.
Yeah, but if you anonymize it in the right ways for research purposes.
No, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, look,
That's
Google
the-
is like has done a pretty good job at getting people not to really care too much about that stuff. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, another big issue is, why does someone need to have a degree, any degree in biology or chemistry to be a lab assistant? Because so many of the lab assistants that you have here doing research at the school all have, for the most part, at least undergraduate degrees, if not
Yeah.
masters or PhDs, to do research when a lot of what they're doing
Is physical stuff.
manual labor.
Yeah, I think that's probably true as well. I mean, there's probably some safety stuff you'd have to teach them, but probably not a lot.
But why can't that be covered as a part of, on-the-job training?
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah.